The Varric Dominion did not announce their arrival. That was the first thing humanity got wrong in every simulation, every war game, every think tank projection run by the Planetary Defense Commission since first contact in 2079. We assumed they would hail us. We assumed there would be ultimatums, demands, the dignified theater of negotiation before violence. We had watched too many of our own films. We had written too many of our own scripts. They came out of the dark side of Jupiter on a Tuesday morning in March. 19 capital ships. 47 escort vessels. A debris field of smaller drones that spread across the ecliptic like a plague of locusts, each one no larger than a city bus, each one carrying enough directed energy payload to melt a destroyer down to its keel bolts. The first signals reached Earth's deep space array at 3:47 Greenwich Mean Time. By 3:52, every government on the planet had been woken from their sleep. By 4 o'clock it no longer mattered. The Varric Dominion had been watching us for 60 years. We know that now. 60 years of passive observation, signal intercept, cultural modeling, all of it fed through their strategic assessment apparatus to arrive at a single, cold conclusion. Humanity is not yet a threat. But it will be. Remove it while removal is still cheap. That was their word for it. Dr. Yusuf Okafor, who later became humanity's first xenolinguist of consequence, spent 11 years translating the Varric strategic documents recovered after the war. He told an interviewer once that the word they used didn't map perfectly to cheap in English. It was closer to efficient. Or perhaps clean. A surgical word. A word that carried no hatred in it, which Okafor said, was somehow worse than if it had. They didn't hate us. We were simply a variable they intended to eliminate. The defense of Earth was not glorious. Let that be said plainly, without apology, because the truth of what happened deserves better than mythology. The combined fleet of the United Earth Defense Command, 114 ships ranging from the heavy cruiser Johannesburg to the orbital gun platforms ringing the L4 and L5 Lagrange points, met the Varric advance formation somewhere between the orbit of Mars and the asteroid belt. The engagement lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. When it was over, 63 of our ships were destroyed outright, 19 were crippled and drifting, and the remaining 32 retreated in the only direction they had left, back toward Earth, where they might at least force the Dominion to fight through them before reaching the atmosphere. Captain Adiz Nwosu of the UEDC Carthage filed the last coherent battle report of that engagement. Her ship was missing its forward 2 decks. 40% of her crew were casualties. She wrote the report herself, by hand, on paper, because the Carthage's digital systems were running on emergency backups. The report is preserved now in the Museum of the Consolidation in Lagos, sealed in argon behind 3 inches of glass. Schoolchildren visit it on field trips. Most of them don't understand what they are looking at. A piece of paper covered in a dead woman's careful handwriting, detailing the precise arithmetic of a defeat. But that is where the numbers end. That is where the math stops being the whole story. On the Varric flagship Dominion's Patience, a vessel roughly the size of the island of Manhattan set on its side, a junior tactical officer named Tabriolvo was processing targeting data for the orbital bombardment phase. She was 19 years old in Varric reckoning, which placed her somewhere around 23 in human terms. She was the third daughter of High Commander Voharit, the architect of the entire campaign. She had been assigned to the flagship not because of merit, though she had merit, but because her father believed in keeping his bloodline close, where he could watch it, where he could shape it. She was, by every Varric measure, unremarkable. Mid-ranking scores at the Academy of Strategic Arts. A noted aptitude for xenolinguistics that her instructors had tried to steer her away from, gently, then firmly, then by removing the elective from her course list entirely. A tendency to ask questions in briefings that her superiors classified as inefficient curiosity in her performance reviews. She had spent the past 4 months studying human languages in secret. Not for any strategic purpose. Not to gain an advantage in the conflict. She had started because of a human radio broadcast, old, decades old, bounced off the inner planets and caught by a relay station near Ganymede, a recording of what humans called a symphony. She didn't know the composer's name yet. She would learn it later. A man named Dvorak, dead for nearly 2 centuries, who had written something called From the New World while thinking about a homeland he missed. She had listened to it 17 times. She did not understand why it made something happen in her secondary cardiac chamber, a warmth that the Varric physiological lexicon had no precise word for, though the closest translation was something like a recognized sorrow that belongs to someone else. She stood at her targeting station on the Dominion's Patience and watched the data streams as the fleet moved into bombardment formation. She watched the thermal imaging from the atmospheric sensors, the population density overlays, the projected casualty modeling that her colleagues reviewed with the same professional detachment they would give to weather predictions. The numbers were very large. She had processed large numbers before in her training. In training they were abstract. They were measures of efficiency. She looked at the atmospheric imagery of a city called Nairobi. It was early morning there. The thermal signatures of thousands of individual humans moving through streets, boarding transit systems, opening shops, walking dogs she'd read about in her xenolinguistic studies. Someone was making coffee. The atmospheric sensors weren't sensitive enough to confirm that, but she had read enough to know that at this hour, in a city like this, someone was always making coffee. The bombardment clock read T-14 minutes. Tabriolvo did not make her decision then. Decisions of that magnitude are not made in a single moment. They are made across 100 small moments that come before, each one so minor it seems inconsequential, until one day you are standing at a targeting station 14 minutes from an atrocity and you discover, with a clarity that feels almost physical, that you have already made your choice. She had made it somewhere around the fourth or fifth listening of From the New World. She didn't stop the bombardment. She wasn't in a position to stop the bombardment. But she did something smaller and more possible, and it would matter more than she knew. She began to transmit. The signal was received by a human communications officer named Sergeant First Class Daria Petrov aboard the UEDC Carthage. The same crippled ship, the same Adiz Nwosu who was writing her report by hand in a corridor 2 decks below. Petrov almost dismissed it as noise. The Varec used a compressed frequency shift protocol that bore no resemblance to anything in the UEDC codebook. But Petrov had a habit. She had always had a habit, since she was a child in Volgograd, of listening to things twice before deciding they were nothing. She listened twice. The signal was not tactical. It was not a weapon signature. It was structured, patterned in a way that had internal logic, internal rhythm. It repeated. It was trying to be understood. She recorded it. She flagged it. She put a note in the system that would survive the battle and the weeks that followed and eventually reach the xenolinguistics team at what remained of the University of Cape Town. It would take them 8 months to fully decode it. What Tabriolvo had transmitted, in a compressed mathematical notation that she'd designed herself because she didn't trust any existing format not to be intercepted, was a single coherent piece of information. The eastern coastal settlements of your northern continent, grid reference 7 through 12. They will be hit in this sequence. These will be the first. Move them if you can. She had given us 11 settlements. She had given us their targeting order and the bombardment timing. She had given us, in the cold language of military intelligence, advance warning. It saved an estimated 40,000 lives. She had done it while standing at her targeting station, in plain sight of her colleagues, while her father's flagship carried her forward into a war she had decided, somewhere between the fourth and fifth movement of a Dead Man's Symphony, she could not be part of. Not like this. The Varec bombardment of Earth lasted 9 days. That figure appears in every history text, stamped into the cultural memory of the species with the same blunt inevitability as 6 years for the Second World War or 14 months for the Antarctic collapse. 9 days. Countable. It implies a shape, a narrative arc, a beginning and an end. What it cannot convey is what 9 days of orbital bombardment actually feels like to the people standing underneath it. There is no preparing for it. The civil defense drills, the emergency shelter construction programs that had consumed 40% of Earth's discretionary budget for the past decade. None of it was built for this scale. The shelters held. The people in the shelters survived. But the world outside the shelters was being reorganized at the molecular level, and the psychological arithmetic of that, the understanding that the sky itself had become a weapon, produced in the human population a particular species of terror that had no historical precedent. Not panic. Something quieter and more durable than panic. A kind of suspended disbelief. A refusal. The city of Ankara was hit on the 3rd day. It was not the first city struck, nor the last. But Ankara is where our story narrows, where the wide lens of geopolitical catastrophe pulls tight to a single street, a single building, a single moment that would echo forward through centuries of human memory. The Cusi district had been a residential neighborhood once. Apartment blocks, a market, a school, a small mosque whose minaret had been visible from half the district. By the time the Varec ground forces arrived, because there were ground forces, because the Dominion wanted to confirm their work and secure the sites they'd identified for resource extraction, the Cusi district was a landscape of broken concrete and standing fires, lit from below by ruptured gas lines and from above by the orange glow of a sky full of smoke. The UEDC ground forces in Ankara had been reduced to a single reinforced company, the 14th Mechanized Infantry, callsign Iron Gate, operating out of a fortified position in a collapsed parking structure at the district's edge. Their commanding officer, Major Enrique Tavares, had 41 soldiers, 3 functioning armored vehicles, and orders that translated in practice to hold the line and make them pay for every meter. They were making the Varek pay. To their credit, they were doing exactly that. The 14th Mechanized had held their position for 11 hours against a Varek ground element that outnumbered them 6-1, using the rubble of the neighborhood as a force multiplier, conducting the kind of grinding, bitter urban defense that military historians would later call textbook, while acknowledging that no textbook had ever been written for conditions quite like these. But they were losing. Slowly, then faster. The way all defensive actions eventually tip. By 1400 hours local time, they had 23 effectives. 3 of their fallen lay in the corridor of the parking structure because there had been no time and no personnel to move them further back. The armored vehicles were destroyed. The Varek advance element had pushed to within 400 meters of the structure's eastern entrance. Major Tavares, who would survive the battle and live to be 91 and never quite stop being 29 years old in his worst dreams, made a decision. He pulled his perimeter in. He consolidated. He put his people in the deepest, most defensible part of the structure and prepared for the last phase of a holding action, which is the phase where you hold knowing that no relief is coming, because holding still matters even then. That was when Private Saren Sahin reported movement in the rubble field to the northeast. Tabriovo had been on the surface for 6 hours. Getting off the Dominion's patience had required a series of decisions that she had not fully thought through in advance, which was perhaps why they had worked. The Varek military command structure assumed rational, hierarchical behavior from its personnel. It was not prepared for a junior tactical officer who submitted a routine surface survey request citing anomalous thermal signature, possible weapons cache, requires direct confirmation, borrowed a single-occupant survey craft with a cover story smooth enough to pass 3 checkpoints, and then simply did not come back. She landed in the ruins 2 kilometers northeast of what had been Ankara's central district. She was in a light survey suit, not combat armor, because she hadn't been able to requisition combat armor without triggering flags she couldn't explain. The survey suit would stop low-velocity shrapnel. It would not stop a directed energy pulse. She was aware of this. She had a sidearm. She had a first aid kit calibrated for Varek physiology that would be useless for humans, a fact that she had also noted and could not correct. She had a translation module she'd built herself over the past 8 months, loaded with every human language she'd been able to access, weighted toward the regional variants of the area she'd targeted. She was, by any military measure, catastrophically under-equipped for what she was walking into. She walked into it anyway. The rubble field was not silent. It breathed, groaned, the way destroyed structures do as they settle and shift, beams contracting in the cooling evening air, debris finding new equilibria. There were fires. There was smoke that caught the light of the orbital strike still falling elsewhere in the city and turned it amber and bronze, a terrible beauty that she registered and filed away without fully processing, because there was too much to process and she was moving on instinct now rather than plan. She heard the child before she saw him. Not crying. She had expected crying. What she heard was quieter, a rhythmic sound, something repetitive, a human sound she couldn't immediately classify. She followed it through 3 collapsed walls, climbing over a section of flooring that had been pushed vertical by the concussive force of a nearby strike, dropping into a pocket of space where a stairwell had partially survived. The boy was perhaps 4 years old. He was sitting against the wall of the stairwell with his knees drawn up to his chest, rocking slightly, making the sound, which she now recognized as humming, a tuneless, constant humming that she understood instinctively as the sound of a small mind holding itself together through the only means it had available. He was covered in gray dust. There was blood on his left arm, not severe, a surface wound, the kind that looks terrible and is not. His eyes were open. He looked at her. The Varek are not human in their appearance. This should be stated without softening. They are tall. Tabriovo stood 2 meters, bilaterally symmetrical but with a secondary pair of limbs that serve in adults as manipulator appendages and in children as something closer to expressive instruments. Their coloration is bioluminescent at the throat and along the secondary limb joints, shifting with emotional state. Their faces have forward-facing sensory clusters that humans consistently describe as eyes, though the function is broader than vision. She was, by any reasonable assessment of the situation, a monster to him. A soldier of the force that had destroyed his city. An alien in a gray survey suit standing in the ruins of his world. He looked at her. He did not scream. She would think about that for the rest of her life. Later, Much later, when she had learned enough of his language and he had learned enough of hers, and when he was a grown man and she was something between a prisoner of war and a guest of the species she'd betrayed her own people to warn, he would tell her that he hadn't screamed because he'd run out of fear. That is a thing that can happen to small children in catastrophic situations. The fear uses itself up. What's left is something quieter and stranger, a kind of radical openness. He had looked at her and seen not a Varrock, not an enemy, but simply something that was there. She crouched down. She made herself smaller. She had read enough xenolinguistic material on human behavior with children to know that height is perceived as threat, that the reduction of height is perceived as conciliation. She held her secondary limbs still because their light shifts with stress, and she was very stressed and she didn't want him to see that. She said in careful, studied Turkish, "You are safe. I will not hurt you." Her pronunciation was imperfect. The intonation was slightly wrong. But the words were the words. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, in the matter-of-fact way that 4-year-olds have when they have decided something, "I'm hungry." She had no food. She had not thought to bring food. She was beginning to understand that she had not thought to bring many things. But she had thought to come. She had come. That, at least, was true. "I know," she said. "We will find some. Come with me." And he did. The soldier who first saw them coming across the rubble field, Private Sarin Sahin, 22 years old, exhausted beyond the point where exhaustion has a meaning, would later say that she had nearly fired. That her finger had been on the trigger guard, that her breathing had gone through the discipline sequence she'd drilled 10,000 times, that she had been a fractional decision away from ending it there in the dust and the orange light. What stopped her, she said, was the child's hand. He was holding the alien's secondary limb. Not gripping it, holding it. The way a tired child holds something familiar. The way trust looks when it has no language left. Sahin held her fire. She held her fire and called it in, and Major Tavares came to the eastern entrance himself, because he had learned in 11 hours of impossible defense that the things you have to see yourself are exactly the things that don't fit the categories you already have. He saw a Varrock soldier, clearly unarmed or he would already be dead, standing 20 meters from his perimeter, holding a child. The child looked up at him and said in Turkish, "She said there'd be food." Tavares, who had been awake for 31 hours, who had lost friends that day, who had been conducting an 11-hour fighting retreat through the ruins of a city, who was by every measurable standard at the absolute edge of what a human being can withstand, looked at the alien standing in the smoke and the ash and the orange light of a burning city. And he said, "Get them inside." Her name as she gave it to them was Tab. The full designation, Tabriel Vo, 3rd daughter of High Commander Vo Harit, Tactical Officer 3rd Class, Dominion's Patience, would come later in careful increments as the trust necessary to speak it was slowly, painfully constructed. For those first hours in the ruins of the QZ parking structure, she was Tab. She had chosen it herself from her full name, not because it was the most phonetically natural reduction, but because she had noticed, in her extensive reading, that humans shorten the names of people they were comfortable with. She wanted to give them somewhere to begin. It was a small strategic decision. It was also, she would realize much later, the truest thing she did in those first hours, the moment she stopped operating from an intelligence assessment and started operating from something more instinctual. She gave them a name they could say easily because she wanted them to say it. She wanted to be Tab to them, not Tabrielvo, not the enemy, not the asset. Something smaller and more possible. Major Tavares put her in the deepest room of the parking structure, a utility closet that had survived the bombardment with only surface damage to 3 of its 4 walls. He posted 2 guards. He was not naive. Whatever this was, whatever she was Varrock, and the Varrock were presently in the process of destroying his planet. He would extend her the minimum courtesy that the situation demanded. She had brought a child out of the rubble field, and that meant something, and he was not a man who could look at what it meant and then pretend it didn't, but he would also maintain the perimeter, the watchfulness, the professional suspension of trust that keeping people alive required. She understood. She indicated understanding clearly and without resentment, because she understood his position better than he did. She had processed his position from the opposite side for 4 months. She had read the strategic assessments of human military command psychology. She knew exactly how much trust she had earned by bringing one child out of a debris field, and she knew exactly how much more it would take to earn anything beyond that. She sat in the utility closet with the boy, who told her when she asked that his name was Mert, and she waited. Mert ate 3 ration bars in the time it took Major Tavares to conduct a full situation assessment and decide what to do with his impossible guest. The ration bars were human-calibrated, obviously. Tab did not eat. She was not certain she could safely eat anything in this structure, and she was not going to ask for food because asking for food felt like the wrong thing to ask for first. She asked, through the guard at the door, for medical supplies. For Mert's arm. She had looked at the wound and knew it needed cleaning and dressing. She had read enough xenomedicine to understand basic human wound care even if she couldn't perform Varrock procedures. The guard, a young man with a bandage on his own jaw, which she noted with the clinical part of her mind and the other part felt something about, brought a standard field kit and set it inside the door without stepping in. She dressed the wound. Mert watched her do it with the serious attention that children give to procedures that are being performed on them. He did not flinch from her secondary limbs, which she had to use for the finer work because her primary hands were too large for the delicate placement of the adhesive strips. He watched them the way a child watches something new that he has decided he is not afraid of, cataloging, filing, adjusting the internal map. They glow, he said, pointing at the joint where her secondary limb met her shoulder. Yes, she said. Why? She considered how to explain Varrock bioluminescence to a 4-year-old. It is how I show what I feel, she said. Like your face. He looked at her face, the sensory cluster, the secondary ocular membranes, the different geometry of everything, and then back at the glowing joint, processing the equivalents. What do you feel now? He asked. She looked at him. At the dust on his face. At the bandage on his small arm. At the ration bar wrapper in his lap. At the orange light coming under the door. Frightened, she said. And glad. He nodded as if this was a perfectly reasonable combination. Me too, he said. Tavares came to speak with her himself after 3 hours. He brought Sergeant First Class Petrov, who was still aboard the Carthage in another version of events, but in this version had been transferred to ground operations in the final chaos before the bombardment made the point moot. Petrov, who had received and flagged and saved the signal that would eventually be decoded into advance warning for 11 settlements, who did not know yet that the signal was Tab's, who sat across from Tab in the utility closet with a tablet and a translation program. That was poor but passable and looked at her with an expression that Tavares, watching from the door, would describe in his memoir as the look of someone who has just found an equation that doesn't balance and is not sure whether to be afraid of it or fascinated by it. What Petrov was both. Tab answered questions for 2 hours. She answered them precisely, completely, without evasion, because she had made her decision and this was what her decision looked like in practice. She gave them the bombardment schedule for the next 48 hours. Sectors, timing, priority targets. She gave them the ground force strength in the Ankara operational zone. She gave them the command structure of the Dominion's patients, including her father's name, including her relationship to him, which she stated in the same flat tone she used for everything else, as if it were a fact of geography rather than a wound. Petrov stopped at that. The High Commander's daughter? Yes. You're the High Commander's daughter and you? Petrov gestured at the room, the building, the situation, the entire improbable fact of this conversation. Yes, Tab said again. Petrov set the tablet down. Off the record. Why? She asked. Not tactically. Not strategically. The human question, the one underneath all the others. Tab was quiet for a moment. This is documented. Tavares, watching from the door, noted the pause in his own record of the conversation, and Petrov noted it in hers. There is a piece of music, Tab said finally. A human piece. I heard it 8 months ago. It was made by a man who was far from his home, missing something he could not name precisely. I understood what he was missing. I'm not certain I can explain how I understood it because we do not have the same word for it. But I understood it. And I thought, she paused again. I thought that anything that can make that cannot be a variable. Petrov looked at her for a long time. What piece of music? She asked. From the New World, Tab said. Dvorak. Petrov's expression did something complicated. She was Czech, 3rd generation, and her grandmother had played the New World Symphony on a battered vinyl record every Sunday morning of Petrov's childhood. The coincidence was not meaningful in any cosmic sense. Coincidences rarely are. But it landed. Okay, Petrov said. And reached across the space between them and offered her hand, palm up, which is not a human greeting but which Tab's xenolinguistic reading had flagged as a gesture of openness in several human cultures, a showing of the vulnerable surface, and said, Okay, Tab. Tab looked at the hand. She understood the gesture. She placed her own primary hand over it, gently, carefully, aware of the size differential, and held it for a moment. That was the handshake that ended and began everything. The intelligence Tab provided in those first 48 hours is credited by military historians with saving the Izmir coastal evacuation, the Istanbul underground shelter network, and the early warning system that allowed the civilian population of 4 separate bombardment sectors to relocate before the targeting coordinates she'd given made them necessary. The numbers are disputed, historians dispute everything, but the conservative estimate is 60,000 lives across those operations alone. What no strategic assessment has ever adequately quantified is the other thing she did in those 48 hours. She stayed. She could have traded the intelligence for extraction. She could have negotiated her safety from the first moment, used the information as leverage, positioned herself for the most favorable outcome. She was, by training and inheritance, a strategic mind. She understood leverage. She stayed in the utility closet. She answered questions. She dressed Mert's arm a second time when the first dressing needed changing. She sat against the wall in the dark, when the power cells ran low and the lights went to emergency minimum, and she listened to the bombardment continue outside, her father's fleet executing her father's plan, and she did not try to leave. When Tavares asked her, on the second night, why she wasn't negotiating for her own safety, she looked at him with the secondary ocular membranes half closed, which her translation module had once explained to her was a Varrock indicator of something like Rye recognition, and said, "Major, I am the daughter of the man who is bombing your planet. What do you imagine I would be safe from if I left?" Tavares thought about it. "Fair point," he said. "Besides," she added and looked at Mert, who was asleep against the wall, having finally reached the limit of what 4-year-old nervous energy can sustain, "I told him there would be food. I should make sure that remains true." Tavares looked at the sleeping child. Looked at the alien sitting beside him in the half-dark, her secondary limbs dim and quiet, the light in her joints reduced to something barely above a glow. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He went back to the door and he told his guards to bring another ration pack, and he did not ask who it was for. The war lasted 14 months. Tab spent all of it on Earth. This is the part of her story that is most often simplified in popular retellings, compressed into a single dramatic act, the rescue in the rubble, the handshake, and then a jump cut to the aftermath. But the reality was slower, stranger, and in many ways harder than the dramatic version. The reality was 14 months of incremental trust building inside a conflict that had no precedent, no framework, no institutional mechanism for processing what she was. She was not a prisoner of war because the laws governing prisoners of war had been written for human combatants and no one had thought to extend them to aliens, partly because no one had imagined the situation would arise. She was not a defector in the legal sense because there was no legal instrument for processing the defection of a citizen of a species humanity was at war with. She was not a refugee. She was not an ambassador, not yet. She was Tab. That was her working legal status for the first 6 months. Tab. A designation with no category attached. Major Tavares, who had enough problems without adding an alien defector to his administrative burden but who had also apparently decided at some point in the utility closet that this was his problem now and he was going to own it, wrote the first formal request to UEDC Command requesting guidance on her status. The response took 11 days and read in its entirety, "Maintain current arrangements pending further review," which was military bureaucracy's way of saying we have no idea what to do with this, please keep doing whatever you're doing. He kept doing it. Tab was moved from the parking structure to a UEDC field logistics facility on the outskirts of what had once been Ankara's industrial district. She had a room. A real room with a door that locked from the inside. Tavares had insisted on this, over the objections of 3 separate security reviews, and a window that looked out on a courtyard that the logistics staff had, with the particular stubbornness of people who refused to let war take everything, planted with a small garden. Tomatoes. Herbs. A sunflower that grew crookedly and was taller than the fence by the time the bombardment phase ended. She was not confined to the room. She was escorted, always, by a security detail whose composition rotated every 72 hours on a schedule designed to prevent the formation of personal relationships that might compromise security. The schedule mostly worked. Mostly. The man who broke the rotation schedule was Corporal James Osei. He didn't do it deliberately. He did it because he was covering a shift for a colleague who had a fever, and then covering another shift because the rotation officer was managing a supply crisis, and by the time anyone noticed that Osei had been assigned to Tab's detail for 11 days straight, a personal relationship had already formed, which is to say, they had been talking. Osei was 26, Ghanaian, a former secondary school teacher who had been teaching mathematics in Accra when the war started and had enlisted 6 weeks after the bombardment began because, as he put it to Tab, "I could not keep teaching children about numbers while the numbers outside were those numbers." She had understood him immediately. It was the most precise thing anyone had said to her about why humans fought. He brought her human books. He didn't have many, the logistics facility's network access was limited, and physical books in the rubble city were a salvage proposition, but he brought what he could find. A novel in English that he read to her when she struggled with the idiom. A collection of poetry in Swahili that she found, she told him, technically incomprehensible but emotionally very clear. A secondary school mathematics textbook that she worked through in 2 days and then asked him, very politely, if there were more advanced options. He brought her a university-level topology text. She worked through it in 4 days. "You're doing this to make me feel bad about my degree," he told her. "I am doing this," she said, "because mathematics is the same everywhere. It does not require translation." He laughed. She was beginning to understand laughter, the function of it, the social architecture it constructed. She was also beginning to produce it, occasionally, in a form that was not quite human laughter but occupied the same cognitive space, a sound from somewhere in the upper throat that her translation module had once defined as Varric expression of recognized incongruity but which felt, increasingly, like something simpler. She was learning to find things funny. Osei taught her to play chess. She was, he would freely admit, better than him within 3 weeks, at which point he switched to teaching her card games on the grounds that luck was a better equalizer. She learned poker. She learned to read human faces for the tells that Osei told her were universal. She learned the vocabulary of bluffing, the managed presentation of false information for strategic social purposes, and told him that this was, in her assessment, the most human concept she had encountered. "You're saying humans are liars?" he asked. "I am saying," she said carefully, choosing her words, "that humans are beings for whom the performance of reality and the reality itself are understood as distinct things. We are not, as a species, like this. We have no tradition of fiction. We have no art form based on convincing others of things that are not true. We have no," she stopped, searching for the word, "we have no bluffing. And I think that is why your music was incomprehensible to us on a technical level, and yet I understood Dvorak. Because the music was not lying. It was performing a truth that had no other way to be said." Osei looked at her for a moment. Then he put his cards down. "You should write that down," he said. "I have written it down," she said. "I have been writing everything down. I have 12 notebooks." He blinked. "Where are they?" She opened a drawer in the small desk the logistics staff had provided and showed him 12 notebooks, filled from cover to cover in a hybrid notation system she developed that used Varric symbols where human language failed her and human words where Varric concepts were absent. "This," he said, looking at them, "is the most important document in the history of both our species." "The topology textbook is better," she said. But she was laughing when she said it. Almost. The war turned in the 8th month. The technical details belong to military history, and military historians have written extensively about them. The development of the phase inversion countermeasure that neutralized the Varric's primary weapon system. The logistics breakthrough that restored supply lines to the outer defense platforms. The political realignment that brought the 3 neutral human-settled stations into the war on Earth's side, tipping the resource calculation in ways that the Dominion had not modeled. What the technical histories do not capture is how the intelligence that Tab had been providing continuously since the first night in Ankara contributed to those turns. The bombardment schedule. The ground force deployment maps. The communications protocols. The strategic decision-making psychology of the Varric High Command, which she understood from the inside, growing up as the High Commander's daughter, watching her father think. She did not think of it as betrayal. This is important to understand, and it is the thing that human moral philosophy has wrestled with for centuries since. What she was betraying was not her species but her species' choice. She believed, she would argue it until the end of her life, that the Varric were capable of making a different choice. That the decision to eliminate humanity was not a biological imperative but a strategic calculation, and that strategic calculations can be changed. She wanted to change the calculation. She wanted to be the evidence that it could be changed. Her father figured out where she was in the 10th month. She had known he would, eventually. He was methodical and patient, and he was the man who had designed the campaign. A missing survey craft. A junior tactical officer who didn't return. A string of intelligence failures that a forensic analysis would eventually trace back to information that shouldn't have left the flagship. He was not a stupid man. She had never thought him stupid. She had thought him wrong. That was different. He sent a transmission to the UEDC communication relays. It was addressed to her. It was in Varric, which the UEDC cryptography unit translated in full within 3 hours and immediately flagged as priority intelligence, which is how Tavares, now Colonel Tavares, the promotion was months past due, ended up in Tab's room at 0300 hours with a translation printout in his hand and an expression she had learned to read as "I need you to look at this." She read it. The translation was imperfect. The UEDC system flattened the tonal registers that gave Varek its emotional precision. But the meaning was clear enough. "You have made an error." Her father, formally. "The error can still be corrected. You are young. The High Command has agreed to treat your actions as the consequence of an inadequate education in strategic reality. Return before the conclusion of operations, and this is a recoverable situation. You're my daughter. I would prefer to recover it." She sat with the translation for a long time. Tavares waited because he had learned, 11 months of it, that she processed at her own pace and that crowding that pace produced less, not more. "He thinks I'm confused," she said finally. "What are you?" Tavares asked. She looked up at him. The light in her secondary limb joints was very steady. No fluctuation, which he had learned meant not the absence of emotion but the presence of a settled one, something that had been decided and was done being decided. "Clear," she said. She wrote a response. She asked Tavares and Osei and Petrov, who was also there, had become part of the small permanent constellation of people around Tab, the ones who had stopped rotating out of her life, to review it before she sent it. It was very short. In Varek, precision can be achieved in fewer words than in any human language. The UEDC translation was 3 times as long as the original. What it said in essence: "You are not offering me recovery. You are offering me return to a position I have already examined and found indefensible. I have been on this planet for 10 months. I have met what you classified as a variable. The classification was wrong. I am writing down everything. One day someone will read it. Perhaps you. I'm not confused. I am the clearest I have been since I heard a dead man's music and understood that clarity was possible. I'm not coming back." She sent it. She put the transmission terminal down. She looked at the people in her room, Tavares, Osei, Petrov, and one other. Mert, now 5 years old, who had been reunited with a surviving relative and who still visited the logistics facility every weekend, who had at some point in the past 8 months acquired the habit of falling asleep against Tab's side during the long evenings when the adults talked, who was currently demonstrating this habit in the corner chair. She looked at them. "I would like," she said carefully, "to formally request whatever status is most appropriate for someone who has decided that this is home." Tavares looked at Osei. Osei looked at Petrov. Petrov looked at Tavares. "We'll figure something out," Tavares said. The war ended on a Wednesday. Humanity had a tradition, apparently, of significant events occurring on unremarkable days of the week. The armistice was signed in Geneva, because Geneva had survived the bombardment largely intact and had accumulated, across centuries, an institutional weight that made it the instinctive choice for the kind of moment that needed to be made permanent. The signing chamber was the same room, or very nearly, where human beings had signed the end of previous wars, and the symbolism was intentional if slightly strained, because the parties on the other side of the table were not human and did not read symbolism the same way. The Varek High Command sent a delegation of 3. They came under ceasefire protocols that had been negotiated over 60 days of tense back-channel communication. Channels that Tab had helped establish and, in the early days, had served as the sole communication pathway for, because she was the only entity in the negotiation trusted by both sides, and only barely by each. Her father was not in the delegation. The absence was deliberate. Tavares, who had become a general by this point and was part of the UEDC team, recognized the deliberateness immediately, and recognized what it meant. The High Command had made a political decision to distance itself from the individual most associated with the campaign. To turn the war into a policy rather than a person. Her father had been, as the diplomatic phrase had it, reassigned to administrative functions. In human terms, sidelined. The Dominion was doing what governing structures do after catastrophic miscalculations. It was reorganizing so that the miscalculation could be described as someone else's. Tab read the delegation list and said nothing. Her expression, which General Tavares was now expert at reading, was the flat, still one that meant she had already processed this and was not going to spend energy on it. "Are you all right?" Osei asked her. He was there, in Geneva, because he had at some point become her official liaison and then her unofficial representative and then something that no job title adequately captured. He was there because he was always there. "He is alive," she said. "I was concerned he would not be. Would you have wanted him to be in the delegation?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "He would have looked at me." Osei understood. He didn't press it. The Armistice of Geneva established 4 primary terms. The first, complete cessation of all Varek military operations in the Sol system. The second, immediate withdrawal of all Dominion forces to a boundary defined by the orbit of Saturn. The third, the establishment of a joint commission, the first interspecies governing body in known history, to negotiate reparations, reconstruction, and the long-term framework for coexistence. The fourth term was not widely reported at the time. It was listed in the annexes, buried in the technical language of diplomatic frameworks, as Article 14C, status of transferred persons during conflict period. What it meant in practice was that Tab was not a criminal. She was not, under the armistice framework, subject to Varric legal jurisdiction for her actions during the war. She was not subject to UEDC military jurisdiction either, having never been formally inducted into any human military structure. She was, in the careful language of Article 14C, a person of extraordinary circumstance whose status shall be governed by principles of humanitarian recognition rather than conventional legal category. In practice, no one had authority over her. She was answerable to herself. It took the diplomats 41 days to produce this language, which Tab read through once and then told Osei was technically adequate but philosophically incoherent. Osei told her that this was what most diplomatic language was. She said she was aware. She was given the choice of where to live. The Varric delegation offered her a return passage, framed carefully as an option available to you regardless of legal status, because the Dominion had other political incentives at play and one of them was not appearing to have abandoned their nationals, even nationals who had comprehensively abandoned them. The offer was genuine enough within those constraints. She declined it in writing, which she had learned was the human convention for decisions you wanted to be unambiguous. She chose Ankara. Not the logistics facility. The city. The rebuilding city, which was not yet a city again, which was rubble and scaffold and temporary structures and the particular organized chaos of a population that has decided it is going to stay and rebuild, damn the cost, damn the time, damn everything, because Ankara had several things that other places did not have. It had the parking structure, now partially cleared and marked with a small plaque that Tavares had arranged without telling her, a piece of engraved metal on the wall of what had been the utility closet, which said only, "Here in March something began that was larger than the war." It had the logistics facility garden, the crooked sunflower now dead but with a new generation seeded from its own fallen heads. It had Mert, who was 6 now and whose surviving grandmother had settled in the rebuilding district and who came to find Tab every day after school with the relentless certainty of a child who has decided that certain presences in his life are simply non-negotiable. It had already the 12 notebooks, now supplemented by 41 more, all of which Tab had been told by Dr. Yusuf Okafor's predecessor at the University of Cape Town represented the single most significant xenolinguistic document in human history. She had told him that was very gratifying and asked if there was a university library she could use, because she had run out of mathematics textbooks. There was. She used it. She stayed. The hardest years were the middle ones. Not the war years, not the years immediately after. Those had the clarity of crisis and recovery, which are both conditions that produce purpose. But the years after the scaffolding came down and the rebuilding was done and life became, for the first time since March, ordinary. Ordinary was harder than war. War has a direction. Ordinary is the work of finding your own direction, every day without the crisis to do it for you. She was the only Varric on earth. This is obvious but its weight accumulates across years. Every room she entered, she was the only one. Every public space, every gathering, every quiet moment in a rebuilt neighborhood, she was the only. She could read human faces with considerable accuracy by then, she could speak 4 human languages fluently and 2 more passably. She had more human friends than she could have conceived of in her life before. And she was still the only one. She wrote about it. She wrote about it extensively, in the hybrid notation that had evolved across the 53 notebooks into something that linguists at 3 universities were now studying as a document of cross-species psychological development. The isolation, she wrote, is not loneliness exactly. Loneliness is the absence of connection. This is the presence of connection and the simultaneous absence of recognition. They are very different conditions. Loneliness can be cured by people. This requires something else. What it required, she eventually concluded, was time. The accumulation of time in a place, until the place's memory includes you, until you are not a novelty in it but a fact of it. Until someone can say that corner where the old Varric used to sit and read, and the sentence is nostalgic rather than strange. She was working toward being the old Varric who used to sit and read somewhere. It took decades. She got there. Osei married someone else. He told her first, which she had not known to expect but which, when it happened, she understood was right, that he was the kind of person who told the important people in his life important things, and that her place in the category of important people was secure enough that he needed to tell her. She was glad. She told him so. She attended the wedding and was photographed, which produced a photograph that became one of the most reproduced images of the post-war period. The Varrock woman who had warned humanity, standing next to the man who had been her first real human friend, at his wedding in a rebuilt church in Ankara, her secondary limbs lit warm amber, which her translation module would have rendered as recognized joy that belongs to someone else, but which she herself would have said by now, was simpler than that. She was happy for him. The photograph was titled by the news agency that first published it, "The War is Over." Tab saw it years later in a museum retrospective and told the curator that she thought the title was inadequate. The curator asked what title she would have given it. She thought for a while. "Something that began," she said. She gave testimony exactly once. This was in the 43rd year after the armistice, when the first formal Joint Commission on the History of the Consolidation War. The name had settled into usage by then, consolidation, chosen because it was what the Varrock had intended and because naming it that felt like an act of honest accounting rather than euphemism, convened hearings on the question of individual moral responsibility. The question was, legally, what was owed? By the Varrock dominion to humanity. By individuals within that dominion who had acted in ways that the new interspecies legal framework classified as crimes against conscious life. The hearings were not a war crimes tribunal. The armistice had explicitly foreclosed that avenue, but they were something. An accounting. A formal naming of what had happened by people who had been part of it. The commission asked Tab to testify. She agreed. She had conditions. She would testify once, in full, and the testimony would be complete. She would not be asked to summarize, to condense, to present only the portions convenient to any narrative the commission preferred. They agreed. She suspected they would have agreed to more, given who she was and what her presence at the hearings meant. She was 62 years old in human reckoning. In Varrock terms, she was in the early part of what would be called, if she were living among her own people, her second life. Varrock maturation comes in two distinct phases, and the second is, in many respects, the more intellectually productive one. She was healthier than she looked to humans who consistently read her physical presentation as older than it was, because they had no reference for Varrock aging and defaulted to human patterns that didn't apply. She looked like General Tavares, now retired, 90 years old and in attendance that day in the commission chamber because he had told his family he would be there if it required him to be carried in on a stretcher. She looked like, he said in his memoir, someone who had been somewhere very difficult for a very long time and had decided to be all right about it. The testimony ran 11 hours across 2 days. It is preserved in full in the archives of the Joint Commission, available to researchers, and it has been read by more people than any other primary source document from the consolidation period. What follows here is only the ending, the last part of what she said on the afternoon of the second day, when the commission chair told her that she had covered the required material and she said, "I would like to add something that was not in the questions if that is permitted." It was. She paused. She had the stillness that people who are choosing words with real care have. "I want to speak to why," she said, "because the questions have covered what I did, and when, and what the strategic outcomes were. But the why has not been asked, perhaps because the commission assumed it was a simple question with a simple answer. Defection, conscience, opposition to the campaign. And it is all of those things. But it is also something smaller." She folded her primary hands on the table in front of her. Her secondary limbs were still. "There was a child in a stairwell," she said. "He was 4 years old. He was covered in dust. He was humming to himself because he had run out of other resources. He had nothing left except the ability to make sound, and he was making it. And when I came through the wall, when I came into his space, which was already a terrible space, he looked at me. I'm not human. I am nothing that he would have been prepared for in any context, much less in that one. And he did not scream." She paused. "He was hungry. That is what he told me. Not what are you? Not go away. He told me that he was hungry. Because that was the thing that was true, and he told me the true thing. And I..." Another pause. The chamber was very quiet. "I understood that I had been taught, my entire life, that the beings on this planet were a variable in a strategic calculation. And I understood, in that stairwell, that whoever had taught me that had never been in a stairwell with one of them. That the calculation was done by people who had processed data about humans and had not met one. Had not had one tell them a hungry truth in the ruins of their home." She looked at the commission members. At the human ones and at the Varrock representatives, who were there because the joint framework required them to be and who had been watching her for 2 days with expressions she could read. Her species, she could read them, as something between shame and careful political calculation. I am not a hero, she said. I want to be precise about this because the histories are not precise about it, and imprecision accumulates into mythology and mythology is not useful. I was a junior tactical officer who did one thing that was right because I had been given, by accident, by a radio signal caught at a relay station near Ganymede, enough information to know what right was. The music cracked something open. The child walked through it. I followed him. That is all. She looked at her hands. It was enough. I'm glad it was enough. I cannot account for why it was enough in my case and not in others. I do not know why I listened to the music twice. I do not know why Sergeant Petrov listened to the signal twice. I do not know why Private Sahin did not fire. There are many points at which the sequence could have been different. I do not have a satisfying answer for why it was not. She raised her eyes. What I have is 43 years of being here. Of watching this place rebuild itself from rubble and become, again, a place where people make coffee in the morning and teach their children mathematics and play music. Imperfect, contentious, occasionally baffling to me in ways I have stopped trying to fully resolve. Alive. The last word landed in the room differently than the ones before it. I would like, Tab said, to say something to the people in this room who are descendants of the people who were on this planet during the consolidation, who grew up in the aftermath, who learned about it from people who were there or from records or from the plaques on buildings and the names of streets. I would like to say, I am sorry. Not on behalf of the Dominion, I cannot speak for the Dominion and I am not asked to. For myself. I was there. I was part of the force that came to this planet and made the calculation that your lives were a variable. I was a small part of that and I tried to unbe a part of it and I am glad the trying mattered. But I was there. She paused one last time. And I am glad to still be here. If that is permitted. I am glad. The commission chair, a woman named Dr. Amara Mensah, 65 years old, a legal philosopher who had written the ethical framework for the joint governance protocols and who was known throughout the academic community for a rigor that admitted very little sentiment, looked at Tab for a moment. Then she said formally, for the record, "Your presence is permitted, Tab. More than that. It is valued." Her name went into the language. This is how it happened. A schoolteacher in the rebuilt Kuzi district of Ankara 40 years after the war, struggling to explain to her students, 7 and 8 years old, the concept of moral courage in a context they could understand, found herself saying, "It is like what Tab did." She didn't plan it. It was just the most precise shorthand available for a specific combination of things. Knowing what is right against every institutional pressure, doing it anyway, accepting the cost. The phrase spread. The way things spread when they fill a gap that language had left open. To do a Tab, this is the construction that appears in the popular idiom records from about 60 years post-armistice. Documented first in Turkish and Arabic and spreading outward through the linguistic networks of the consolidation generation's grandchildren. It meant, to choose the harder right over the available wrong. To cross a line that has been drawn between you and someone else and say, this line is not real enough to stand on. The formal historians argue about whether this constitutes the highest form of commemoration or a dangerous reduction. Both perhaps. Both things can be true. Mert Yildiz grew up to be an architect. This is not incidental. He chose architecture because, he said in an interview given when he was 47 and his firm had just been commissioned to design the Consolidation Memorial in Geneva, he had grown up in a destroyed city and watched it rebuild, and the rebuilding had seemed to him the most important work that people did, and so he had decided to be part of it. He did not mention Tab in that interview. He mentioned her in every other interview he gave, in a way that suggested he had decided she didn't need to be explained to the people asking about the memorial, because the memorial itself explained her. The Geneva Consolidation Memorial, completed when Tab was 89 years old in human reckoning, is a structure that has no interior. This was the point Mert made to the commission that approved it and that he made again to every journalist who asked about it, that a memorial to loss should not be something you can go inside of, because loss is not something you can be inside of and come out unchanged. You walk around it. You see it from the outside. You see yourself reflected in the panels of material, an alloy he developed specifically for the project, reflective but not perfectly so, like water in low light, and you see the names. The names are on the interior face. The ones you see reflected are distorted, partial, the way memory is. The actual names you have to lean in to read. You have to come close. Tab's name is not on the memorial because the memorial is for the dead. But Mert placed one thing inside it, visible only to those who read the construction notes carefully enough to find the reference. In the alloy mix, at a ratio that affects neither the structural properties nor the reflective quality in any measurable way, there is a compound derived from a varric mineral. Present but invisible. Part of the structure without being announced. he said when a journalist finally found the reference and asked him about it. She taught me that presence doesn't have to be loud to be real. Tab died in the 91st year after the armistice. She was 112 in human terms, which was, for a Varrock of her generation, not particularly old. She might, under other circumstances, have had another 40 or 50 years. But she had spent her second life on a planet with a gravity differential and atmospheric composition that required constant physiological compensation, and the cumulative effect of that, her physicians told her, had compressed her timeline. She told them she was aware. She had done the calculations herself decades earlier and had elected not to discuss them widely, because she saw no utility in having people spend years anticipating her death rather than simply living alongside her. She died in Ankara. In the apartment she had occupied for 60 years on the street named, without her consent, she had objected strenuously, and been overruled by the municipal council with a cheerfulness that she had found, grudgingly, difficult to argue with. Tabrielvo Sokagi. Her windows looked out on the neighborhood that had been rebuilt around and over and through the ruins where she had first walked into Mert's stairwell. She left 57 notebooks. The last entry was written 11 days before she died, in the hybrid notation that had, by now, been formally recognized as a distinct linguistic system and was taught in 3 university xenolinguistics programs. The translation is not perfect. Translations of Tab never were, but the approximation runs. I have been trying to identify what it is that humans do that makes them the specific kind of difficult and worthwhile that they are. I have had 90 years to study this. I have 57 notebooks of data. My conclusion is, they persist. Under conditions that their own calculations would tell them should produce surrender, they persist. Not because they do not understand the calculation, they understand it very well, but because they have decided, as a species, at a level beneath policy and above instinct, that the calculation is not the only measure. That there is something worth being stubborn about. I came here because a piece of music told me that. I stayed because a 4-year-old boy in a stairwell confirmed it. I have been confirming it ever since. I am not the story, though I know that is how it will be told. The story is the species that was worth the risk of telling it for. I was only the one who happened to be listening at the right time. I would do it again. I would do it 1,000 times again. The math always comes out the same. The last speaker at her funeral was Mert Yildiz. He was 73 years old. He had not been told he would be the last speaker. The ceremony had been planned to end with a formal address by the Joint Commission chair, but when the chair finished and sat down, Mert stood up without announcing himself, walked to the front, and the ceremony organizers made the decision correctly to let him. He spoke for 4 minutes. He had not prepared what he said, it was not written down, and the only record of it is the audio from the ceremony, which has been transcribed many times and in which every transcription agrees on the substance but differs slightly on the exact words, which is perhaps appropriate. He said, he was 4 years old in a stairwell covered in dust. He was humming because he had run out of other resources. And something came through the wall that was not human, that was frightening in ways he couldn't have articulated because he was 4 and didn't have the vocabulary, and it crouched down and made itself smaller, and it said, in imperfect Turkish, "You are safe." He said he believed it. He had no rational basis for believing it. He believed it anyway. He said, she said there would be food, and there was food, and she stayed, and she kept saying things that were true for 90 years, she kept saying true things, and he was 73 years old and he had spent his whole life being grateful for a creature that crouched down to be less frightening in a ruined stairwell, and he didn't have words large enough for it, and he didn't think words were the point. He said, the point was that she was here. For 90 years she was here. He said, we should be so lucky as to be what she thought we were. The children learn it young. Not the political history, that comes later, in secondary school, with the timelines and the fleet dispositions and the casualty figures and the treaty language. They learn that later when they're ready to hold the weight of numbers. What they learn young is the smaller story. The one about the stairwell. The child covered in dust, humming. The alien who crouched down. The imperfect Turkish. The food and the staying. They learn it the way children learn the things that matter most, told by someone who loves them in a quiet voice, often at night, often with that particular quality of emotion that adults have when they are telling children about something that still undoes them years and years later, in ways they couldn't explain if asked. The teachers, the ones who have taught it long enough to know what children do with it, say that the question the children ask most often is not what happened next or did the humans win or even where is she now. The question they ask most often is simpler. They ask, why did she do it? And the teachers say what Tab herself said at the commission, what she wrote in 57 notebooks, what she tried, across 90 years and 4 languages and a hybrid notation system and an architectural alloy and an idiom that entered the language of a species she had never been born into. She was listening. And she heard something she recognized. And she could not pretend she hadn't. That is the story they tell. That is the story the children carry.